Life Audio.
Hey, Dr. Bill Sinyard here with Gospel Rant and God's Love for the Unlovable. Today, I want to do a shameless plug for my new book. It's a biblical historical fiction, The Rabboni, The Lost Mission Journals of St. Matthew. It's available now on Amazon and Kindle. It has already earned a 5-star review for biblical historical fiction from Reader's Favorite. I'm grateful for that acknowledgement. You can also find out more on my book page, gospel-app.com/Rabboni, Rabboni. If you're a fan of The Chosen, I think you're going to love The Rabboni. So, Chosen watchers, here's my question for you. What happens to Matthew after The Chosen is done? In fact, 4 decades later, 73 CE. Well, in this show, I'm going to be reading 2 chapters. Like I said, the Rabboni picks up some 40 years after Jesus' life and death, a handful of years after Matthew publishes his biography, what we call the Gospel, and the temple was destroyed by Rome. So these are the long-lost journals of the Apostle Matthew. He and a colorful team of men and women followed the dangerous missionary charge of Jesus to go into all the world, and in their case, that's Ethiopia, and preach the gospel. Well, as you'll see, Matthew's team was a striking testimony to the saving grace of their Lord. There was a former prostitute, a recovering opium addict, a shamed African princess, a freed Roman slave, and even a former member of the Sanhedrin who was present that evening that Jesus was condemned to die. Fun, right? Matthew is surprised how, of all the things he penned, it is Jesus' signature message on the hillside in Galilee that has most captured the interest of unbelievers and stirred up so much misinformation among his own followers. I would go out on a limb and say that Jesus' words on that hillside were so radical and contradictory to the very core values of Rome and Jerusalem, it's surprising that he wasn't killed right on the spot. Well, I'm going to read 2 chapters from the Rabboni to give you a feel for just how powerful the book is, how interesting it is. It's for Christians and should be instructive and encouraging, but in some ways, like The Chosen, it's a great portrayal of both the glory and the humanity of Jesus for unbelievers as well. So here he is preaching the Sermon on the Mount at the beginning of his ministry. Some definitions are going to be helpful as we get into these 2 chapters. The first beatitude, right, Matthew 5:3, is this: Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Well, that should be pretty familiar. But Matthew and his audience in Ethiopia speak Greek. So you will hear the words makarioi or makarios, which is blessed, which means fortunate or worthy. Then tokoi, which is poor, and pneumati, which is spirit. And as Matthew will explain, poor in spirit are those poor people, real people stuck at the bottom of the societal food chain, whatever your context might be. So maybe it's economic, maybe physical, maybe it's health, maybe it's racial, family of origin, sex, sexuality. Think of the most put down mental, emotional issues, abuse, oppression, being ignored, bullied, being treated with injustices. The despised group, that's the tokoi and pneumati, the poor in spirit. They will not be able to move up or improve their lot by just trying harder, no matter how many times you tell them. They need a rescue, and that's what Jesus was telling them on that day. He has come to rescue the most neglected, the most unclean among us. God's love has always been for the unlovable, the unloved, and the unlovely, and that's all of us on any given day if we were just a little bit honest. Okay? Well, I'm going to take a short break for our sponsors, and then I will read the 2 chapters from the Rabboni. We'll be right back. So here are the 2 chapters from the Rabboni, the Lost Mission Journals of St. Matthew. Are you ready? Day 246 of the Oxum Mission. Jesus smiled and repeated his first words. You who came with no one envying your life or story, now you are people truly to be envied. Why? You are now a people of the high God benefactor, the God of glory. There was a moment of silence. People looked at one another for clarification, and a sweeping murmur rolled over the slope. All of that was awkwardly interrupted by an aged man just an arm's length below where Jesus sat. "What did he say?" The broken old cripple far too loudly inquired of his daughter. You know, the way a hearing-impaired person might misjudge how loud their voice is. The man was draped in tattered old clothes, his body painfully twisted and bent over, his wispy white hair helplessly blowing in the near-constant breeze coming from the lake. Red open sores covered the exposed parts of his emaciated body. He was not long for this world. He and his daughter were sitting exposed to the Galilean sun on one of the large black basalt rocks littering the southern slope. He leaned his tired head on his daughter's shoulder for support, and clearly his hearing was almost gone. "What did he say?" He loudly blurted out again, rolling his head slightly towards her face. "Tell me, daughter, what did he say? Heaven is what?" For a moment, the crowd's attention was jerked away from Jesus, only for a moment. His daughter respectfully shushed him and said, "Well, the Rabboni said," and she looked down to the ground and thought, wanting to get it right and to make it clear for her Abba. "He said you are Makarios, Papa, and the kingdom of heaven is yours." The old man blinked his nearly blinded eyes a couple of times, probably to get a little focus. He rolled his head on her shoulder ever so slightly to look skyward. A peacefulness flowed over his face, his brow unfurrowed for the first time in a long while. "The kingdom?" He coughed a couple of times in an unsuccessful attempt to clear ever-present mucus from his lungs. It's mine?" "Yes, Papa." He paused. And then the most surprising thing, he laughed. "God is mine again?" he cried. And then he laughed out loud. Again, not a mocking laugh, but a joyful, hilarious one. It started as a deep, resonant snigger, but then interrupted as a guffaw. If he could, he would have danced. Jesus, the great Rabboni, paused to intently watch as this scene unfolded, as if the old man was an audience of one. He smiled and gazed directly into the face of this broken man. Shockingly, the great Rabboni slid off the basalt boulder he sat on, took a couple of steps toward the old man, grabbed both of his old shaking hands, and danced with him, actually, for him. They both laughed. It was such an endearing scene. Jesus was fully there, fully engaged. He was like no other Rabboni ever. It was as if to say, "I feel that joy too, old man. That's why I've come. Makar is yours. Enjoy. Enter your rest." The old man, for a moment, in the smiling presence of Jesus, felt the embrace of God. The arms of heaven reaching around him, hugging him as he was, not as he should be or could be. He was in the highest possible sense, Lipnei Elohim, an ancient Hebrew concept of being in the presence of God. But this time, not anxious about God's wrath or disappointment, but truly knowing God's favor towards him, close enough to see his smile over him, to feel his joy over him. He couldn't help but laugh. I can testify laughter and gratefulness are most often fingerprints of what worship looks like in Jesus' kingdom. Laughter and dancing are the most common fruit of a person becoming makarioi, blessed or enviable. To put it another way, in this new kingdom, the tokoi, right, the poor in spirit, those who believe they have no hope for joy, happiness, real intimacy, feeling valued, and who know they cannot and won't be able to dig themselves out of the holes they are in, they're the ones who now find themselves makarioi. They dance at last as they are, not as they should be or should have been. Quite a surprising thing, really. The tokoi would never, ever expect that. They haven't felt the urge to laugh for some time. They had long given up on experiencing Makarios. Healing all the physical ailments among the crowd was great, but in the end, temporary. Jesus had come to rescue tokoi from their shame and celestial loneliness. Physical healing is great, but it does not accomplish such rest. Far from it. Jesus' goal was not just health, but Makarios. I now know this to be true. I've said it before, but it is important. You can be tokoi and makarioi at the same time. You can be deeply wounded, suffering from ongoing shame, a discard from society, impaired and broken, and still be in a remarkable place of the Makarioi favor of the heavens. I'm sad to report the old man died just a week or so after this audience with Jesus. I know this because his daughter shared the account with me personally. She is now part of my mission team here in Aksum. Bernice is remarkable, by the way. I do not think we could do this without her. She has single-handedly organized our work for the impoverished and the tribal regions of the desert. I taught her accounting and finance, and now she runs it all. Bernice told me she brought her dad that day at great cost and sacrificial effort because on top of all of his physical issues, he had also been suffering for a long time from a deep malaise. She told me that as a young man, he had great faith in God, but he had sometime before just stopped believing. In fact, stopped saying anything at all. He would wake up in the morning and just silently sit in his chair, staring at the barren wall until it was time to go to bed again. She couldn't remember the last time her father smiled, much less laughed, until he engaged Jesus. Or better, Jesus engaged him. Jesus' gift for him had changed something in him. Then, until he died, his depression was changed to joy every day until his last breath on earth. His last words were about hearing angels laughing over him. And then he quietly was brought to his Father's with a smile still on his face. In his last few days, he had become a mighty witness, a living testimony of Jesus' unique kingdom. Day 260 of the Aksum mission. One more story. There are so many of that day. In a clump of palm trees not far from where the old man now danced was another group of women. One, Callista, whose name means beautiful one in the Greek, just shook her head in derision at Jesus' words. Callista was not a real name. She was a Jewess once. She had been married to a righteous man, or so he said. They had a couple of children and lived comfortably in a small village in the Decapolis. There came a time when he grew tired of her and gave her a writ of divorce. She did not see this coming at all. And to make matters worse, the synagogue supported him and granted his request. Instantly, she was thrown into poverty, a deep, drowning structural poverty. She could not stop the downward spiral. Her family turned away from her. This was an honor-shame culture, and they did not want to share her shame. What could she do? Because of her divorce, even the few jobs open to women in her village were put out of her reach. She could beg, and would have for her family's sake, but we all know how the righteous, non-shamed others feel about having to see such shame every day. It's so uncomfortable to have such a person hanging around begging every day, a constant reminder of how fast a fall could be. No one wanted the intrusion or the subconscious threat. No matter how hard she begged, at the end of the day, she was not able to feed her children. So she turned to the one occupation that embraces such a shamed one. She moved to a nearby city, one that serviced the Via Maris, and became a prostitute. Her choice? Well, some would critically and judgmentally say yes. She would say she had no choice. Now there was no turning back. There is no Makarios for her type. Life is what it is for the unclean. Dramatic clothes and deepening makeup helped to cover the decline of her beauty, but there was no relief from that inner nagging shame, the deep, ongoing sadness, and yes, the loneliness. She would dance too if she was paid enough, if it made her more coin, but not because she felt the joy. At first, she didn't relate at all to the crazy, outlandish notion of being Makarioi. And by the way, she expected nothing from God either, other than judgment. Or worse, she expected only to see disappointment in his face. That's what she would do if she were him. Do you know the pain of that? Tokoi do. Her life's hole was so deep. Sure, she had dug some, but it wasn't all her fault. She couldn't see any way out. She would tell you there were days she contemplated taking her own life. But to what end? Just so she could more quickly stand in front of Yahweh as judge? No need to rush fate. Sure, Jesus can convince an old, foolish man to dance, but she's heard it all before. She will not be disappointed again. She will never be sucked into this emotionalism. She would tell you she didn't know why she came. Many of her clients had heard Jesus speak and said she might enjoy the show. She told each no, but secretly came with 2 friends and stood back in the shadows of the small oasis. Do you know what made her shake her head? She had heard the very same word recently from a newer wealthy client. Makarios are you, woman? Men were all alike. She didn't feel Makarios then or now. Why would she? She was an object to be used for the pleasure of others and then to be paid for it. That was her value, what the market would bear, nothing more, nothing less. Joy? Too expensive for her and her type. The peace of the gods? Absurd, beyond absurd. But then, Jesus. As she watched the Rabboni dance with the old man, something cracked inside of her. It was more than just a feeling, more than an awareness or a new strength or even a new hope. She felt something she hadn't known for a long, long time: honor. Jesus didn't walk up to her and grab her hands. That wouldn't have gone well. She was still in too much pain. But even from where she was, maybe 50 feet from Jesus, she felt the power. She was embraced. That's how she puts it, by invisible arms. She felt special for a second. Her, the prostitute, the shamed wife, mother, and failed Jewess, as she was. Though she stubbornly refused to dance then and there, something inside of her dared to. How do I know this? She's now my wife. She has no reason to have made the story up. I get kidded all the time about being the new Hosea. You may remember the prophet who was commanded by God to marry Gomer, a prostitute, a symbol of God and his pursuing love for the Anawim. That's Hebrew for tokoi. Well, first, I'm no Hosea, far from it. And Deborah, oh yes, that's her Hebrew birth name, is no Gomer. Deborah would have done anything she could have to have been rescued from her life, from her shame, from her bad choices, from what was done to her unfairly, what was taken from her, the reduction in her identity every time she allowed a man or woman to abuse her so. But she could not. She didn't have that kind of power. Her life hole was so tragically deep, so digging further was mere foolishness. She had no time for such foolishness. She changed that day, or better, was changed a little. To put a name on the change, let's use Makarios. And to make a long story short, she sold all she had and followed Jesus. She stayed at a distance for days. Deep chronic shame dies so slowly. She told me for a long time she wanted to remain anonymous, afraid of how people would look down at her or reject her. She couldn't take that. She still used her Greek name until one day she danced. Deborah danced. Now she is one of our most powerful spokesperson for the kingdom gospel of Jesus to men and women alike. She has become her namesake, the prophetess Deborah, the great woman, judge of Israel. And her favorite talk starter is, every saint has a past and every sinner has a future. She's so right. When Jesus said, Makarioi are the tokoi to pneumati, theirs is the kingdom of heaven, he had their attention. Nothing was more unlikely. Nothing was more improbable. Thank the heavens he didn't say, Makarioi are the tokoi who figure it out, or who work harder, or who choose to follow my principles or teachings, or who bring suitable sacrifices, or say this mantra, or give it all to the poor, or who stop their addiction, or who are willing to admit their inabilities, who are open to healing. No. He said the long-expected kingdom of God would be made up of rescued tokoi such as us, as we are, but it would not leave us as we are. This new kingdom Jesus proclaimed was now right here in the middle of the crowd and surrounding it as well. The former refuse of this world are now embraced by the heavens. They experience what only God does. Unbelievable. except for one thing. Jesus said so, and his power is inexplicable. It wasn't the words of Jesus that convinced the Tokoi. Clearly, the Tokoi are very resistant to slick talking heads casting out promises of better things. They had been burned before and had quick triggers for boundaries. No, it wasn't just the words. It wasn't how Jesus said the words. It was Jesus there, present, his remarkable thick empathy radiating out towards the previously untouchables. It was also something else. There was a power that flooded across the hillside that day. And every day Jesus spoke. It was power making Tokoi experience Makarioi. It made them feel honored and a little bit honorable. It made them feel respectable. It made them feel pure, clean, whole, in a word, enviable. A little. It made them feel less anxious about what God feels towards them. It made them, for a moment, feel God dancing over them as they were. It made them receive and want more. Well, forgive me, I'm ranting, but I need to stop here and take a breath. In my interviews of those who were there at the beginning and then later after, Makarios is one of the words Rabboni used the most. It is the one word of the Rabboni I hold most dearly. Well, I hope you enjoyed that. Good time for another break from our sponsors. I'm going to be right back. Well, there it is. Lots of biblical theology in narrative form. The gospel in 3 dimensions. Fun. I hope you enjoyed it. There's so much more there. If you love the Gospels, if you love The Chosen, you're going to love this book. And by the way, we go deeper into the Sermon on the Mount than most sermon series because it's in story form. Everybody will benefit no matter where you are in your faith or even if you're not a believer at all. Narratively, Rabboni is structured around a new groundbreaking exposition of the Sermon on the Mount. My hope was to bring the Sermon on the Mount to a familiar audience in a whole new life-changing way because it's told from the point of view of eyewitnesses. Yeah? The Rabboni also gives you a lot of historical context you may not have heard. The incense wars between the Nabateans and Rome, the ongoing animosity between Galilee and Judea, the historically underreported behind-the-scenes story of the turbulent last years of Jerusalem just before it fell, and so much more. Listen, have you ever wondered what John's baptism was all about? You won't believe it. What was going on between the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the Essenes, and the Zealots? Because each one is going to play a major negative role in Jerusalem's downfall in 70 AD. What did Jesus mean when he said, "Theirs is the kingdom of heaven" in Matthew 5:3? It's very important and often overlooked. Do you know why Judaism was spared total obliteration in 70 AD? And how and by who? Well, here's what some are saying. Quote, the Rabboni is a captivating journey through history, offering a compelling blend of biblical scholarship and storytelling that will resonate very well with readers interested in the early Christian era. That's award-winning author K.C. Finn. Here's another one. Quote, I was deeply touched by the book, moved to tears. It renewed the Sermon on the Mount for me and brought out Jesus' sense of humor. I love that. Rabboni has already received readers' favorite 5-star coveted review for biblical historic fiction. If you're interested in the history of the Jews and early Christians, right, the 1st century CE, you're going to love the Rabboni. If you want to know even more about the Sermon on the Mount, check out my study materials, my small group materials on the website, gospel-app.com. It's called Jesus Said What? The Radical Beatitudes. It's a workbook for small groups. It's also available as a video series at Right Now Media. Help us by getting this out to fans of The Chosen that you know and friends who just can't get enough of the Bible. Get a copy for your pastor, minister, your priest. They will thank you. It's great for book clubs and study groups. It will generate a great deal of discussion. Believe me, there's lots of stuff in here you probably have never heard. Oh, and by the way, if you love the book, give us a good review at Amazon and Goodreads. You won't believe how much that helps us get the word out. If you want a signed copy, order it from the website in the next 2 weeks and send me a email requesting a signature, bill@gospel-app.com. We will get it right out to you. Thanks ahead of time. Next show, we will get back to our trek through the book of Hebrews. See you there. Take heart, child of God.